Edward Miller was no ordinary man. At 78, his life was an enigma to most. Dressed in faded shirts and worn-out shoes, he moved through his days in quiet humility. His modest home in the suburbs spoke nothing of his extraordinary past, a secret he had carried for decades. "Grandpa, do you think Ferraris can fly?" asked Arthur, his 7-year-old grandson, one evening. The boy's face lit up at the mention of the sleek cars he adored. Edward chuckled, ruffling Arthur's hair. "Not yet, my boy, but they can make you feel like you're flying." Arthur was not just any child. Diagnosed with a cruel, degenerative illness, his days were numbered. But his spirit was unyielding, his dreams soaring above the clouds. His biggest wish? To ride in a Ferrari. Edward had overheard Arthur's heartfelt confession to his mother Alice during one of his visits. The boy's fragile voice had echoed in his mind ever since. "I just want to know what it feels like to sit in one, Mom. Just once." That night, Edward stared at the dusty photograph of his late wife on his bedside table. "If there's one thing I can do for him, it's this," he murmured. Little did anyone know that Edward had the means to make this dream come true. Decades ago, he had won a massive lottery but had chosen a life of simplicity. To him, wealth was not a badge of honor. It was a tool, one he now planned to use in the best way imaginable. The following morning, Edward put on his best shirt, still frayed at the edges, and set off for the luxury car dealership. His heart raced, not from fear of rejection, but from the sheer importance of his mission. "This is for Arthur," he whispered to himself as he approached the gleaming glass doors. Inside, the dealership was a world of polished chrome and pristine glass. The Ferraris on display gleamed like jewels under the soft spotlight. Edward felt like an intruder in a palace. "Keep your focus," he told himself. His grandson's smile was worth every ounce of discomfort. "Excuse me," Edward began, approaching a sleek red Ferrari. Before he could say more, a man in an immaculate suit stepped forward. "May I help you, sir?" The man's tone was polite, but his eyes swept Edward with disdain. "Yes," Edward said, ignoring the man's judgmental stare. "I'm here to buy a Ferrari." A snort escaped the man, whose name tag read, "Andrew, manager." "A Ferrari? Are you sure, sir?" he asked with barely concealed sarcasm. "You do realize these aren't just any cars?" Edward's voice was steady, though his hands clenched his old wallet tightly. "I know exactly what they are, and I know what I want." Andrew's mocking smile widened. "Sir, with all due respect, these cars cost more than a house. Maybe you should consider—" "Stop," Edward interrupted firmly. "I am here to buy this car, for my grandson." Andrew laughed outright now, a cold sound that echoed across the room. "For your grandson? That's rich." Humiliation washed over Edward, but he stood his ground. "I can pay for it," he said simply. Andrew's tone turned icy. "Look, sir, I don't want to waste my time or yours. These cars are for serious buyers. Now, if you'd excuse me—" He gestured toward the door. Edward's heart sank, but before he could retreat, a soft voice broke the tension. "Sir, please wait." A young man with kind eyes stepped forward. "I'm Ryan, a salesman here. I'm sorry for my colleague's behavior. Let me show you the cars." Edward hesitated, his pride warring with his desire to make Arthur's dream come true. But Ryan's sincerity won him over. "Thank you," Edward said quietly. As they walked toward the showroom, Ryan glanced back at Andrew, who rolled his eyes and walked away. "Don't mind him," Ryan said. "Let's find the perfect Ferrari for your grandson." For the first time that day, Edward felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Arthur's dream wasn't so far out of reach. Edward followed Ryan across the gleaming showroom floor. The Ferraris on display seemed to shimmer with life, their vibrant colors and aerodynamic designs exuding power and elegance. Ryan's tone was warm and engaging, a sharp contrast to Andrew's earlier scorn. "This one," Ryan said, motioning toward a striking red Ferrari. "It's one of our most popular models. Beautiful, isn't it?" Edward nodded, his eyes softening as he imagined Arthur's face lighting up at the sight of the car. "It's perfect," he murmured. Ryan smiled but hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Sir, if I may ask, why this car? I can see it means a lot to you, but it's not every day someone walks in wanting to buy a Ferrari for their grandson." Edward paused, his hand grazing the car's smooth surface. For a moment he considered keeping the truth to himself, but something in Ryan's demeanor, his genuine kindness, prompted Edward to open up. "My grandson Arthur is 7 years old," Edward began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "He's been battling a severe illness, one that doesn't give us much time." Ryan's face softened, his eyes reflecting understanding. "He's always loved cars," Edward continued. "Ferraris in particular. To him they're more than just vehicles. They're freedom, speed, life." Edward's voice faltered briefly. "All I want is to give him a moment of joy, something he'll remember forever." Ryan's chest tightened as he listened. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Miller," he said, his voice sincere. "Arthur sounds like an incredible boy, and I promise I'll help you make this happen." Edward nodded, grateful for Ryan's compassion. As the two discussed potential models, the weight of Arthur's wish hung in the air. Ryan, moved by Edward's story, excused himself to make a phone call. "Give me just a moment, Mr. Miller," he said. "There's someone I think you should meet." Stepping away, Ryan dialed his mother, Abigail, who owned the dealership. She answered on the second ring. "Ryan? What's going on?" "Mom," Ryan began, his voice tinged with urgency. "You need to come to the dealership. There's a customer here, Mr. Miller, and his story. It's something you need to hear in person." "Is everything all right?" Abigail asked, her concern evident. "Just come," Ryan insisted. "Trust me, you'll understand when you meet him." Abigail agreed and promised to arrive shortly. Meanwhile, Ryan returned to Edward, offering reassurance. "My mother is on her way. She'll want to meet you, and I'm sure she'll help make this work." Edward looked at him, hesitant. "I don't want to trouble anyone," he said softly. "You're not," Ryan replied firmly. "This isn't just about selling a car. It's about something much bigger." When Abigail arrived, her presence was commanding yet warm. Dressed elegantly but simply, she walked with purpose, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Ryan greeted her at the entrance. "Mom," he said, gesturing toward Edward. "This is Mr. Edward Miller." Abigail approached Edward with a kind smile. "Mr. Miller, it's a pleasure to meet you. Ryan has told me a bit about your story." Edward stood, his weathered hands clutching his wallet. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I didn't mean to cause a scene, but your son was very kind to me." "Ryan has a good heart," Abigail said, glancing fondly at her son. "But please, tell me more about Arthur. I'd like to understand how we can help." Edward hesitated briefly before recounting Arthur's story once more. He spoke of the boy's strength, his dreams, and his love for Ferraris. As he described Arthur's illness, his voice cracked, but he pressed on, determined to convey just how much this meant to him. By the time Edward finished, Abigail's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice steady but emotional, "your story has touched me deeply. I can't imagine what your family is going through, but I want to help." Edward looked at her with quiet hope. "Thank you," he said. Abigail took a deep breath. "Here's what I'd like to do. I want to offer you the Ferrari as a gift for Arthur. Consider it a gesture from us to help make his dream come true." Edward blinked, stunned. You'd do that?" "Absolutely," Abigail replied. "This isn't just about business. It's about doing the right thing." For a moment, Edward was speechless, but then he shook his head. "I appreciate your generosity truly, but I can't accept that. I have the means to pay for the car, and I insist on doing so." Abigail tilted her head, surprised. "I've lived my life simply," Edward explained, "but I've been fortunate. I want this to be a fair transaction, not a handout." Abigail studied him for a moment, her admiration growing. "Very well, Mr. Miller," she said finally. "If that's what you wish, we'll make it happen." As they finalized the details, a sense of purpose filled the room. Everyone knew this was more than just the sale of a car. It was the beginning of something extraordinary. With the paperwork nearly complete, Edward felt a surge of relief. Arthur's dream was finally within reach. But just as Abigail excused herself to fetch the final documents, the glass doors of the dealership swung open. Andrew, the smug manager from earlier, strode back in. His face was still clouded with irritation from his earlier errand, and when his eyes fell on Edward, his expression darkened further. "Why is he still here?" Andrew sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Sir, I thought I made it clear earlier. This is not the place for you." Ryan stepped forward immediately. "Andrew, that's enough," he said firmly. But Andrew ignored him, addressing Edward with increasing hostility. "You can't seriously be wasting everyone's time pretending to buy a Ferrari. Let's not turn this into a circus." Edward's hands tightened around the edge of his chair. Before he could respond, Abigail returned, her sharp heels clicking across the floor. She had heard Andrew's last remark, and her face hardened with quiet fury. "Andrew," she said, her voice like steel. "A word." Andrew turned, startled to see her. "Miss Abigail, Not another word," she interrupted coldly. "I've heard enough. Your behavior is appalling and completely unacceptable." "But, Ma'am, I thought—" "You thought wrong," Abigail snapped. "This dealership is built on respect, integrity, and compassion. You've failed to embody any of those values. Consider this your last day here." Andrew's face turned pale, and he stammered incoherently, but Abigail's decision was final. "Leave. Now." Shame burning on his face, Andrew stormed out of the dealership. The room fell silent until Edward finally spoke. "Miss Abigail," he began, his voice calm, "thank you for standing up for me. But if I may, I'd like to ask for something." Abigail softened at his tone. "Of course, Mr. Miller. What is it?" "Andrew may have been wrong," Edward said, "but everyone deserves a second chance. If there's any way to help him learn from this, I think he'd be better for it." Ryan's eyes widened with admiration, and Abigail studied Edward for a moment before nodding. "You're a remarkable man, Mr. Miller. I'll consider it." The transaction was completed shortly afterward, and Edward was handed the keys to a sleek red Ferrari. The sight of the car felt surreal, less a vehicle and more a bridge to Arthur's happiness. "Thank you," Edward said, his voice trembling as he addressed Abigail and Ryan. "This means the world to me." Ryan smiled. "Let's not waste any more time. Arthur's waiting." Together they drove to the hospital, the Ferrari's engine purring softly as it cut through the evening streets. Edward led the way in the car, while Abigail and Ryan followed in another vehicle. When they arrived, the golden hues of the setting sun bathed the hospital's exterior in a warm glow. Edward stepped out of the car, clutching the keys tightly, and made his way to Arthur's room. Alice was by Arthur's bedside, her face lighting up in surprise when she saw her father enter. "Dad? What's going on?" Edward approached his grandson, his voice soft. "Arthur, I have a surprise for you outside. Do you feel up to seeing it?" Arthur's eyes, though tired, sparkled with curiosity. "A surprise? What is it, Grandpa?" "You'll see," Edward said with a small smile. With the help of a nurse, Arthur was carefully placed in a wheelchair and brought outside. The moment his eyes fell on the Ferrari, his jaw dropped in awe. "Grandpa, is that—" Arthur's voice trailed off, unable to contain his excitement. "It's yours for today, champ," Edward said, his voice thick with emotion. "What do you say we take it for a spin?" Arthur's face broke into the biggest smile Edward had ever seen. "Yes, please, Grandpa." Carefully, Edward and Ryan helped Arthur into the passenger seat of the Ferrari. Arthur's tiny hands eagerly ran over the leather seats and steering wheel, his eyes wide with wonder. "Ready?" Edward asked, his voice trembling slightly as he buckled Arthur in. "Ready!" Arthur exclaimed, his excitement palpable. Edward started the engine, the car's low growl reverberating through the air. As they pulled away, Arthur let out a gleeful laugh that echoed in Edward's heart. They drove through the city streets, the wind rushing past them, and the sunset painting the sky with brilliant colors. For Arthur, every moment was magical, a dream come to life. When they returned to the hospital, Arthur's energy had waned, but his joy remained undiminished. As Edward helped him out of the car, Arthur looked up at his grandfather with shining eyes. "Grandpa," he said softly, "this was the best day of my life." "Thank you," Edward knelt beside him, holding his small hand. "Anything for you, Arthur. You're my everything." As they wheeled Arthur back inside, Abigail and Ryan watched from a distance, deeply moved. "He's an extraordinary man," Abigail said. Ryan nodded. "And Arthur, he's a reminder of why we do what we do." The Ferrari sat gleaming in the fading light, a symbol not just of luxury but of love, determination, and the power of a fulfilled dream. The next few weeks were bittersweet for Edward and his family. Arthur's health continued to decline, and the sparkle in his eyes became rarer with each passing day. Yet, the memory of the Ferrari ride remained vivid, a beacon of joy amidst their struggles. Alice often caught Arthur recounting the details of that day to his nurses, his voice filled with excitement. "The engine roared so loud, and it felt like we were flying," he would say, his hands mimicking the wheel. It was a story that brought smiles to everyone who heard it, even as it masked the harsher reality of his condition. Edward, too, clung to that day. Every detail, from Arthur's wide grin to the wind rushing past them, felt etched into his soul. Sitting alone in his garden one evening, Edward whispered to the photograph of his late wife, "We gave him a moment of happiness. That's all that matters." Arthur's condition took a sudden turn one quiet morning. The doctors called Alice and Edward into the hospital, their faces solemn. "We don't have much time left," one of them said gently. Alice broke down, clutching her father's arm as he stood in stunned silence. But even in those final days, Arthur's spirit remained unbroken. "Grandpa," he said softly one evening, "I'll never forget our ride in the Ferrari. It was like I was in a dream." "You were the dream, Arthur," Edward replied, his voice trembling, "and you always will be." A few days later, surrounded by his family, Arthur passed away peacefully, leaving behind a void that no words could fill. The grief was immense, but so was the resolve to honor Arthur's memory. Abigail and Ryan visited Edward and Alice a few weeks later, bringing flowers and a quiet determination. "Mr. Miller," Abigail began, her voice steady but emotional, "Arthur's story has touched everyone at the dealership. We've been thinking about how to keep his memory alive, not just for your family, but for everyone who walks through our doors." Edward looked at her curiously. "What do you mean?" Ryan stepped in, his voice filled with conviction. "We want to rename the dealership in Arthur's honor, to remind us and everyone else that life isn't just about cars or business. It's about fulfilling dreams and showing kindness." Alice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "You'd do that for Arthur?" Abigail nodded. "Absolutely. He inspired us. His joy reminded us why we do what we do. This is the least we can do to celebrate his spirit." Edward's voice broke as he said, "He would have loved that. Thank you. Thank you so much." The dealership underwent a transformation in the weeks that followed. The building's exterior was repainted, and a new sign was commissioned. "Arthur Miller Dealership, where dreams come true." Below it, a plaque was placed with a short inscription about Arthur and the ride that had changed all their lives. On the day of the grand reopening, Edward, Alice, and many of their friends and family gathered at the dealership. The event was not just a ceremony, it was a celebration of life, love, and hope. During the event, Abigail stepped forward to deliver a heartfelt speech. "Arthur Miller showed us that dreams, no matter how small or big, can change lives. His story has become a part of who we are, and we hope this place will inspire everyone who visits to believe in the power of kindness and second chances." Edward was invited to speak next. His voice was steady, but his eyes glistened with emotion. Arthur taught us that even in the face of life's greatest challenges, we can find joy in the simplest moments. This dealership will always remind me of him, not just because of the name, but because of the love that made this possible. Thank you for keeping his spirit alive." The audience erupted into applause as the plaque was unveiled. The words, "Where dreams come true," shimmered in the sunlight, a fitting tribute to the boy whose love for Ferraris had inspired so many. Even Andrew, the former manager, was there, standing quietly in the crowd. He had undergone a transformation of his own since that fateful day. Inspired by Edward's forgiveness, he had taken steps to better himself, attending empathy workshops and volunteering at community organizations. When the event ended, Andrew approached Edward. "Mr. Miller," he began hesitantly, "I don't deserve your kindness, but I wanted to thank you. You gave me a second chance, and it's changed my life. I'll never forget that." Edward smiled warmly. "Everyone deserves a chance to change, Andrew. What matters is what you do with it." From that day forward, the Arthur Miller dealership became a place of inspiration. Customers often stopped to read Arthur's story on the plaque, and many left with more than just cars. They left with a renewed sense of hope. For Edward, the dealership wasn't just a building. It was a living memory of Arthur, a place where his laughter and dreams continued to echo. And so, the legacy of a little boy who loved Ferraris lived on, touching the lives of everyone who walked through those doors and reminding them that dreams, no matter how fleeting, are worth chasing. Months after the dealership's transformation, Edward found himself visiting it often, not as a customer, but as a part of its soul. He would sit quietly near the plaque, watching families, couples, and dreamers walk through the doors. Each time someone paused to read Arthur's story, Edward felt his grandson's presence, alive in the way his memory inspired others. One afternoon, Abigail approached Edward, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to him and sat down beside him. "You've been coming here a lot lately," she said with a smile. Edward nodded. "This place, it feels like Arthur. It's a reminder that even though he's gone, his dreams continue to touch others." Abigail placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Arthur changed us all, Mr. Miller. Because of him, we see the world differently, more compassionately." At that moment, a young boy and his father entered the showroom, their eyes lighting up at the sight of a gleaming red Ferrari. The boy ran up to the car, his face filled with the same wonder that Arthur once had. Edward watched, his heart full. "Arthur would have loved seeing this," Edward said softly. "He'd say this was a dream come true." Abigail smiled. "And that's exactly what this place is now, a place where dreams come true." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the dealership, Edward stood by the plaque one last time that day. His hand grazed the engraving of Arthur's name, and he whispered, "You're still making magic happen, my boy." Before walking away, Edward turned to Abigail and Ryan, who stood nearby. "Thank you for everything. This means more to me than words can express." Abigail nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. It's because of you and Arthur that we've found a greater purpose." As we close this chapter, let Arthur's story remind us all of the power of love, kindness, and the pursuit of dreams. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this. Leave a comment below. What's a dream you would do anything to fulfill for someone you love? Thank you for joining us on this journey. May your day be filled with inspiration, and may you find the courage to make dreams come true. See you in the next story.